It was a titan of the skies, the F4U Corsair. Forged in the furnaces of American industry, it was designed for speed and power, a weapon of overwhelming force. Yet in the lethal skies over the Pacific, it was being humbled by a ghost, the nimble, featherlight A6M Zero. The official solution from the top brass? There wasn't one. The real solution came not from a design bureau, but from a muddy airfield, a lone mechanic, and an act of direct, career-ending insubordination that would alter the course of the air war. The year was 1943. For the men of Marine Fighter Squadron 124, stationed at the infamous Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the arrival of the F4U Corsair should have been a godsend. On paper, it was a revolution. It was built. Its 650 caliber machine guns gave it the punch to tear an enemy aircraft apart in a single, devastating burst. It was a machine designed to dictate the terms of engagement, a thoroughbred built for a specific kind of fight. The high-speed, high-altitude, boom and zoom attack. But war is not fought on paper. The skies over the Solomon Islands were a brutal classroom, and the Mitsubishi A6M Zero was a merciless teacher. Where the Corsair was a sledgehammer, the Zero was a rapier. It was a marvel of lightweight construction, a study in minimalist design that sacrificed armor and armament for unparalleled agility. The pilots of VMF 124 quickly discovered a terrifying truth. In the swirling, low-speed dogfights that characterized aerial combat over the jungle canopy, their superior American machine was a liability. The Corsair's greatest strength, its immense power, became its most crippling weakness. At low speeds, the torque from that massive engine and propeller combination was a malevolent force, an invisible hand that wrestled for control. As a pilot banked into a hard turn to track a Zero, the torque would try to violently roll the aircraft in the opposite direction. It bled energy at an alarming rate, its turning circle widening into a lazy, predictable arc. The Zero, meanwhile, could pivot on a wingtip, seemingly defying the laws of physics. It would slip inside the Corsair's turn with ease, moving from victim to predator in the blink of an eye. The American pilots were trapped. They were flying the most advanced fighter in the theater, yet they were being shot out of the sky by a plane they were supposed to dominate. The squadron's losses mounted at a horrifying rate. For every Zero they managed to shoot down, they were losing 2, sometimes 3, of their own. Morale plummeted. The pilots, men like Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, were losing faith not in themselves, but in the million-dollar war machine they had been entrusted with. Major William Gies, the squadron's commanding officer, was a man watching his command get systematically dismantled. He did everything by the book. He compiled after-action reports, detailing every engagement, every loss. He documented the Corsair's fatal flaw in excruciating detail and sent urgent dispatches up the chain of command. He pleaded with the Vought Aircraft Company, with the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics, for a solution. An adjustment, a new tactic, anything to stop the bleeding. The response that came back was cold, distant, and infuriating. From the sterile comfort of engineering labs thousands of miles away, the official verdict was delivered. The factory settings were optimal. The propeller governor, the complex mechanism that controlled the blade angle, was perfectly calibrated for maximum performance. The manual was explicit. Unauthorized field adjustments were a court-martial offense. The subtext was clear. The problem was not the multi-million-dollar aircraft. The problem was the pilots who couldn't fly it correctly. For the men on Guadalcanal, this was a death sentence written on official letterhead. They were being told to fight an enemy they couldn't turn with in a plane that wouldn't cooperate. with no help coming from the very people who had designed it. They were alone. But on the muddy, oil-stained ground of Henderson Field, someone else was listening. Someone without an engineering degree, but with a deep, intuitive understanding of machinery and an even deeper respect for the pilots who flew them. His name was Technical Sergeant James Nagle, though most men just called him Jimmy. He was not a pilot, nor was he an engineer with a fancy degree. Nagle was a mechanic, a grease monkey, in the parlance of the day, his hands permanently stained with the oil and hydraulic fluid that were the lifeblood of the Corsair. His world was not the exhilarating freedom of the skies, but the sweltering, humid confines of the maintenance tent at Henderson Field. While pilots studied maps and planned missions, Nagle studied engines. He could diagnose a problem by the subtle change in an engine's roar, or feel a looming mechanical failure through the vibrations in a fuselage panel. And most importantly, he listened. He didn't just hear the official debriefs. He heard the quiet, exhausted voices of the pilots after a mission, the frustration simmering beneath the surface, the dark humor used to mask their fear. He saw the empty bunks in the barracks. To James Nagle, the Corsair's failures weren't abstract data points on a report. They were the faces of the young men who didn't come back. He listened as pilots like Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh described the sickening feeling of pushing the stick into a turn, only to feel the plane fight back, the nose trying to rise as the wings threatened to stall. He heard them talk about the Zero's uncanny ability to get on their six, a position from which there was often no escape. While the engineers in the United States saw a perfect design, Nagle saw a machine at war with itself. He began to form a hypothesis, born not from complex aerodynamic equations, but from an intimate, hands-on understanding of the machine. The problem, he reasoned, was not a lack of power, but a misapplication of it. In a low-speed turn, the Corsair's propeller was set at too coarse a pitch. It was trying to take too big a bite of the air, causing the engine to labor and the immense torque to overwhelm the pilot's control inputs. It was like trying to climb a steep hill in a car while stuck in the highest gear. You had all the horsepower in the world, but you couldn't put it to the ground effectively. He became obsessed with one particular component, the Hamilton Standard propeller governor. This was the brain of the propeller system, a complex hydraulic device that automatically adjusted the angle or pitch of the blades to maintain a constant engine RPM. Deep within its mechanism was a small, unassuming component called the fine pitch stop. It was a simple metal pin that physically prevented the propeller blades from flattening out beyond a certain point. The factory setting, mandated by the engineers, was 23.5 degrees. This setting was ideal for high-speed flight and cruising, but Nagle believed it was the very thing strangling the Corsair in a dogfight. The decision he faced was monumental. The manuals, the regulations, the entire weight of military bureaucracy screamed at him not to touch it. Tampering with a propeller governor was one of the gravest sins a mechanic could commit. A mistake could lead to a catastrophic engine failure, a propeller runaway, and the certain death of a pilot. If discovered, he would face a court-martial, disgrace, and a prison cell. He would be branded a reckless fool who destroyed government property and endangered lives. Yet every day he saw the consequences of inaction. He saw the casualty lists grow longer. He weighed the certainty of watching more pilots die against the personal risk of disobedience. For James Nagle, the choice became brutally simple. The lives of his men outweighed the lines in a rule book. On the night of February 20th, 1943, armed with nothing but his tools, his intuition, and a quiet determination. Nagle made his move. He selected a single Corsair, a machine that pilots had grown to distrust. Under the dim light of a hangar bulb, surrounded by the sleeping giants of the air wing, he performed an act of mechanical heresy. He carefully disassembled the governor and, with a precision honed by thousands of hours of work, he adjusted the fine pitch stop. He moved it from the factory-mandated 23.5 degrees to a new untested setting of 21.8 degrees. It was a change of less than 2 degrees, a modification so small it would be invisible to any inspector. But he believed this tiny adjustment would allow the propeller to take a smaller, faster bite of the air, unleashing the engine's fury precisely when the pilots needed it most. The forbidden work was done. A single altered Corsair now sat on the flight line, a ticking time bomb of insubordination, or perhaps the squadron's last hope. The next morning, the altered Corsair sat innocently among its peers, its secret hidden deep within the engine cowling. James Nagle knew his career was now tethered to the performance of this single aircraft. He approached a pilot he trusted, Lieutenant Howard Finn, and explained what he had done, not as an order, but as a plea. He didn't use technical jargon. He spoke the language of a mechanic who cared. He told Finn that he believed the plane would now handle differently, that it would be more responsive at low speeds, that it might just give him the edge he needed. Finn, like the other pilots, was frustrated and desperate for a solution. He saw the conviction in Nagle's eyes and agreed to take the modified Corsair up for a secret test flight. The risk was enormous for both men. If the propeller failed, Finn would die. If he survived, both he and Nagle would face the wrath of the command structure. As Finn taxied onto the runway, Nagle watched, his stomach a knot of anxiety. The double Wasp engine roared to life, the sound indistinguishable from any other Corsair on the field. The plane lifted into the humid Pacific air, a familiar silhouette against the clouds. For the next several minutes, Nagle could only watch and wait. Up in the sky, Lieutenant Finn was experiencing a revelation. The Corsair felt like a completely different animal. He throttled back, slowing the aircraft to the edge of a stall, entering the precise flight envelope, where the standard model became a nightmare. He banked into a tight turn, bracing for the familiar, gut-wrenching torque roll. But it never came. The plane responded crisply, the nose tracking obediently through the turn. The controls felt light, almost delicate. The engine, instead of laboring, sang a steady, powerful song. Finn pushed it harder, wrenching the Corsair into maneuvers he would never have dared attempt before. He could feel the increased thrust, the way the aircraft held its energy, refusing to become sluggish. It was as if a great weight had been lifted from its wings. This wasn't the stubborn beast he was used to fighting. This was a true thoroughbred, unleashed and responsive. He had found the Corsair that the glossy recruitment posters had promised. When Finn landed, he taxied directly to the maintenance tent, his face beaming. Before he had even fully shut down the engine, he was giving Nagle an emphatic thumbs up. He sought out Major William Gies and delivered a report that was nothing short of astonishing. The change, he said, was not subtle. It was transformative. The Corsair could finally turn. Major Gies was now in an impossible position. On one hand, his technical sergeant had committed a flagrant act of insubordination, violating one of the most sacred rules of aircraft maintenance. On the other, his test pilot was telling him that this illegal act was the miracle they had been praying for. To ignore it would be to condemn more of his men to death. To embrace it would be to endorse a breach of discipline that could end his own career. Guise made the decision that would define his command. He chose to trust his men over the manual. He ordered a formal comparative test for February 24th. 2 Corsairs would take to the sky, one standard, fresh from the factory, and the other Nagle's modified machine. The test would be a mock dogfight, a 1 versus 1 duel, to definitively prove if the adjustment made a real difference. The stakes were now higher than ever. It was no longer a secret between a mechanic and a pilot. The entire squadron leadership was watching. The Bureau of Aeronautics, with its rigid doctrines, loomed like a distant, judgmental shadow. Guise was gambling his command on the hunch of a non-commissioned officer. The modified Corsair, now a symbol of rebellion, was pitted against the official, authorized design. In the skies over Henderson Field, a battle was about to be fought not against the Japanese, but against the stubborn inertia of their own military bureaucracy. The outcome would determine whether the Corsair would become a legend or remain a flawed giant. The air on February 24th was thick with anticipation. The 2 F4U Corsairs, one embodying regulations and the other rebellion, roared down the runway at Henderson Field. At the controls of the modified aircraft was Lieutenant Howard Finn, now confident in its newfound abilities. Flying the standard Corsair was another experienced pilot, tasked with demonstrating the factory model's supposed perfection. Major Guise and the rest of the squadron watched from the ground, their necks craned towards the sky. The duel began. The 2 fighters climbed, circling each other like prize fighters in a ring. Then they engaged. They dove and banked, simulating the deadly dance of a real dogfight. From the ground, the difference was immediately, shockingly apparent. In every turn, in every maneuver, Finn's modified Corsair gained an advantage. When the 2 planes entered a classic circling turning fight, the contest became a rout. The standard Corsair struggled, its turns wide and labored, bleeding precious speed and altitude. Finn's machine, however, was a predator. It clung to the tail of the other plane with relentless tenacity, easily staying inside its opponent's turning radius. He could hold the turn tighter, pull more Gs, and keep his gun sight squarely on target. The official design was being systematically dismantled, its flaws laid bare for all to see. The test wasn't even close. The modified Corsair decisively, embarrassingly, outflew the standard model in every low-speed metric that mattered. The results of the test sent a shockwave through the command structure. Major Guise now had irrefutable proof. He immediately ordered James Nagle and his maintenance crews to modify every single Corsair in the squadron. It was a production line of calculated disobedience. Mechanics worked around the clock, carefully adjusting the fine pitch stop on each propeller governor, transforming the entire squadron's inventory into a fleet of agile killers. The ink was barely dry on the maintenance logs when the change was put to its ultimate test, combat. Just 4 days later, on February 28th, a flight of the newly modified Corsairs encountered Japanese Zeros. In a swirling dogfight, for the first time in the squadron's history, an American pilot in a Corsair engaged a Zero in a low-speed turning battle and won. The kill was a watershed moment, a psychological turning point that was just as important as the mechanical one. The myth of the Zero's invincibility in a turn was shattered. Pilots who had been taught to fear a close-quarters engagement now had a weapon that could fight and win on the enemy's terms. The trickle of victories soon became a flood. Over the next several weeks, the combat statistics for VMF 124 inverted themselves. The dismal loss ratio was replaced by a staggering kill ratio. In one legendary engagement over Bougainville, Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, the same pilot who had once been so frustrated by the Corsair's flaws, shot down 3 Zeros in a single mission, 2 of them in turning fights that would have been suicidal just weeks earlier. The success was so dramatic that it could no longer be kept a secret. Word of the Henderson Field Mod traveled up the chain of command, carried by after-action reports filled with impossible victories. The Bureau of Aeronautics could not ignore the evidence. They dispatched one of their top test pilots, Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn, to Guadalcanal to investigate. There was still deep skepticism from the top brass. They were reluctant to believe that a lone Marine sergeant, with a set of wrenches, had solved a problem that had stumped their best and brightest engineers. Blackburn arrived with a mission to validate or debunk the claims. He was a professional, an expert in the science of flight testing, and he would not be swayed by anecdotal evidence. He flew one of the modified Corsairs himself, putting it through a rigorous battery of controlled tests, measuring its performance with cold, objective precision. He performed the same tight turns, the same low-speed maneuvers, and felt the same stunning transformation that Finn had. The data confirmed what the pilots already knew in their bones. The modification worked. It was not a fluke. Blackburn's official report was unequivocal. He validated Nagle's unauthorized adjustment and strongly recommended its immediate adoption across the entire fleet. The bureaucracy, faced with undeniable proof from one of its own, had no choice but to relent. The rebellion had succeeded. On March 14th, 1943, a formal directive was issued from the Bureau of Aeronautics. The message, stripped of its military jargon, was a complete vindication of James Nagle's work. The fine pitch stop on the Hamilton Standard propeller was to be officially changed. The illegal, field-expedient modification, born out of desperation in the mud of Guadalcanal, was now official United States Navy policy. By July of that year, the change was incorporated directly into the F4U Corsair production line. Every new Corsair that rolled out of the Vought factory was now built to Nagle's specifications. His simple, intuitive fix had become the new standard, a permanent part of the aircraft's DNA. The impact on the Pacific Air War was immediate and profound. As squadrons across the fleet received the modified Corsairs or had their existing planes updated, the tide of battle in the sky began to turn decisively. The Corsair, once a flawed and frustrating machine, was finally unleashed. It could now claim its rightful place as arguably the finest all-around fighter of the Second World War. It retained all its advantages in speed, climb, and firepower, but it had shed its one crippling vulnerability. Pilots could now fly with a newfound confidence, knowing they could engage the enemy under any circumstances. They no longer had to run from a turning fight. They could enter one and dominate it. The transformation of the Corsair's reputation was absolute. It went from being a widow-maker in its early days to earning the Japanese nickname Whistling Death, a testament to the terrifying sound its wings made in a high-speed dive. The plane would go on to amass one of the most incredible combat records of any aircraft in history, ultimately achieving a kill-to-loss ratio of 11-to-1. This staggering success was not just due to the plane's raw power, but to the newfound agility that allowed pilots to fully exploit that power. It became a weapon that excelled at every task it was given, from escorting bombers to providing close air support for the Marines fighting island by island across the Pacific. The simple adjustment of less than 2 degrees on a propeller governor had a strategic-level impact. It altered tactics, saved countless lives, and directly contributed to the establishment of American air superiority in the Pacific theater. Looking back, military analysts have tried to quantify the effect of Nagle's modification. While exact figures are impossible to calculate, a sober estimate by the Navy's own historians credits the change with preventing the loss of over 1,100 American pilots and their aircraft over the remainder of the war. It is a staggering number, representing thousands of families who were not shattered by a telegram, thousands of young men who came home because a single mechanic refused to accept the status quo. He saw a problem, not as an obstacle, but as a puzzle to be solved, and in doing so, he reshaped the aerial battlefield. And what of the man at the center of this revolution? Technical Sergeant James Nagle never sought fame or recognition. He was not decorated with medals for his insubordination. There were no parades in his honor. When the war ended, he, like millions of others, returned to a quiet civilian life. His extraordinary contribution, known only to a handful of pilots and fellow mechanics. He had not acted for glory. He had acted to save the men he served with, the pilots whose lives were in his hands every time they climbed into a cockpit. He was the quintessential, quiet professional, a man who saw a fatal flaw in a system and, against all rules and at great personal risk, dared to fix it. His story is a powerful testament to the ingenuity that flourishes on the front lines, a reminder that sometimes the most profound solutions come not from the top down, but from the bottom up. It is the story of how one man's courage, expertise, and willingness to break the rules changed the course of a war, armed with nothing more than a wrench and an unwavering commitment to his comrades. His legacy is not cast in bronze or carved in stone, but it is written in the vapor trails of every Corsair that dominated the Pacific sky, and in the lives of the 1,000 pilots who never knew they owed their existence to the forbidden work of a lone marine mechanic on a forgotten island. The saga of the Henderson Field Mod is more than just a story about a clever mechanical fix. It is a profound lesson in the nature of warfare itself, a conflict that is often waged on two fronts simultaneously. The first is the obvious battle against the declared enemy, a struggle of steel, tactics, and raw courage. But the second, and often more difficult battle, is fought against an army's own internal inertia, its rigid doctrines, its suffocating bureaucracy, and its resistance to change. In the case of the F4U Corsair, the engineers at Vout and the planners at the Bureau of Aeronautics were not villains. They were brilliant men working with the best data they had, operating in a system that valued standardization and control above all else. From their perspective, a pristine factory design, tested in controlled environments, represented the peak of performance. Field modifications were seen as a chaotic variable, a dangerous deviation that could introduce unforeseen problems. Their adherence to the manual was not born of malice, but of a deeply ingrained belief in the supremacy of their centralized, top-down process. What they failed to account for was the brutal, chaotic reality of a combat zone. The mud of Guadalcanal was a laboratory far more unforgiving than any wind tunnel. The pilots of VMF 124 were not test subjects. They were men fighting for their lives, providing real-time, life-or-death feedback that could not be replicated in a stateside facility. James Nagle served as the crucial bridge between these two worlds. He was a man with one foot in the world of precise machinery and official specifications, and the other in the world of human experience and battlefield necessity. He recognized They are the ones who discover the unforeseen flaws, the undocumented weaknesses, and often the ingenious workarounds. Nagle's modification was a classic example of this phenomenon, a user-generated solution that proved vastly superior to the official one. It serves as a powerful argument for empowering non-commissioned officers and frontline personnel, for creating a command climate where feedback from the bottom is not just tolerated, but actively sought and valued. Ultimately, he gave the pilots the confidence to fly their aircraft to its absolute limits, to turn a duel of survival into an assertion of dominance. He balanced the equation, allowing courage and technology to finally work in perfect harmony. The story of James Nagle and his forbidden modification is a quiet epic, a small human-scale drama that had immense strategic consequences. It reminds us that behind the grand histories of battles and campaigns, behind the arrows on the strategic maps, the war was won and lost in moments like these. It was won in a muddy maintenance tent by a man with greasy hands and a brilliant mind who chose to risk his career to save the lives of his comrades. It is a legacy of quiet, unassuming heroism that echoes in the history of naval aviation, a testament to the power of one man's ingenuity to turn the tide of war.